stay. At the end of the lecture, you may want to pick up the 2 handouts from last week's lecture. I also suggest you introduce yourself to your neighbour and ask them to share their notes and appreciation of last week's discussion. You can do that now. Today's lecture is, as I explained last week, concentrating on Odour of Chrysanthemums. Could everybody wave to me their copy of said text? Raise them high. Marvellous. Have you got a handout? No, the handout is by the dead. Okay, has anybody not got a copy of? Okay, the story is available online, as is explained on last week's handout. The story is also available at someone sitting close to you, so please ensure that you move to sit next to somebody who is able and willing to allow you to share their copy of the book. Because, as everybody knows, this is a discursive environment and there will be substantial periods of discussion and sharing. Okay, so I'm counting on the fact that everybody has read Odour of Chrysanthemums. I don't expect you to put up your hand and say that you haven't. I will simply assume that you have. It's not a very long story, and you've had 7 days to do that. So I trust that everybody has read the story, and so we all know what happens. And in order to test this, I would like you, with your neighbour or partner now, to come up with a 3 bullet point summary of the main elements of the story, please. What do you think are the 3 main elements of the story? She's had sex with her mother-in-law too. Splendid. It's interesting, but D.H. Lawrence is currently in the OED, I believe, as the first person to use the phrase "to have sex." And that particular version of "to have sex" is in fact him saying that that is a kind of debased and inadequate form of coupling and intimacy and so forth. That's just a minor historical fact. But yes, it's about relationships. It's about the relationships, obviously, between the husband and wife, but also the relationships, the familial relationships, the way the children are involved, and then the relation to the mother. Okay, so it's certainly about relationships. What else is it about? Yep?
Regret.
Regret. I've had a few. What kind of regrets?
At a point actually realise that you should have appreciated more and be more passionate in the relationship and inside and realise.
She should have appreciated it more. We'll maybe come on to that because we're going to spend some time thinking about the ending of the text. I mean, it's a very curious way in which this story finishes. Certainly there's regrets. Whether or not she thinks she could have made more of the relationship is an interesting question, given the way that his character developed. But okay, regrets might be a theme. Other themes? Yep?
Death.
Death?
Yes.
Yes. Any expansion on
Not
that?
in like Gothic kind of way, but in the way that it's sort of not dramatised at all. I thought that stood out quite a lot, that he died and she was just like sorting the parlour out and making sure he was alright. It was like a kind of get on with things.
Okay, so we've got 2 things there. One is we've got the fact of death, and it is obviously the death and the waiting for the death, in the sense that is the key theme of the story. But at the same time, it's how we treat death, how we respond to death. There's both a social documentary aspect to the text. Remember last week we talked about Lawrence's documentary functions. Well, we've got a very clear explanation of the laying out of the body, of the way in which a body might be brought up from the pit at the time. So we've got some information about industrial accidents and the nature of life in a small mining community, and then we've got this information about laying out. One could in fact go to further historical studies that are much more detailed in the address of what happens to people's bodies. We won't particularly touch on it today, but there's a very fine essay about this story where a man called Tim Marshall talks about the relation between the story and two things, the Poor Law and World War I. But it's very interesting that some of the revisions, which we'll also talk about, to this manuscript were made between July of 1914 and late October of 1914. During that period, of course, the First World War began, and what one finds very, very quickly in the First World War is that miners are used as part of the army. They're used to undermine the enemy, the German lines, and to put bombs under there and to blow things up. And so what one's got within the story, and within some of the alterations that come into that 1914 version, there are hints of the way in which the war might be impacting on Lawrence's thinking, and the parallels being drawn in terms of some military language between mining and actual warfare. There's also, to go back to the Poor Law issue, there's a question of what happens to a body. Up until 1830, it was illegal to dissect bodies, and this made it very difficult for surgeons and made it difficult for doctors actually to know much about the human body. After 1830, the bodies that one was permitted to dissect were bodies that didn't belong to anybody, bodies that were paupers' bodies. Most often came from places like the workhouses, which you've obviously heard of in the 19th century, which were the places where poor people went to be exploited and crushed. So if you died in the poorhouse or in the workhouse, your body could be used for medical experimentation. And this was considered a great shame, and also something that people were very frightened of. What's very significant about this story is the different points at which the implications of the miner dying and who owns the body becomes part of the kind of the structure of the text. There's a particular phrase that you'll have picked up that later on. She puts her hand on the body in claim. Claiming the body means that she's taking responsibility for the body and for its burial, and obviously for the implications of being a widow at that particular time and place in society. There are all kinds of other elements that repeat that concern about what happens if a man dies in stories of the Prussian officer collection. So you've got, again, that social documentary function on death. So death, absolutely a key theme, both what happens to you practically if someone dies, but then also the emotional structures and ways of responding to death. Okay, so we've got death as a theme. What other key themes do we have in the text? Yeah. Sorry? Beauty. Talk to me about beauty.
Well, I just noticed that there's a lot of imagery of light and darkness, and even the little girl and the little boy, they have something that's beautiful. And then at the end, the mother is looking at her dead son, and she says that he looks beautiful.
Yeah. And in one word, even the wife looks at him and finds him beautiful as well. So yeah, there is this odd set of contrasts. We could start thinking about the novel and the way that it sets up contrasts between beauty and, say, ugliness, between what is good and what is bad. There's a lot of what we might go on to explore as binaries. How do you define what's good? Do you define it in distinction from what is bad? How do you define what's beautiful? It's not always self-evident. It's something that maybe depends upon where you're coming from and the community that you're in. So the things that are good and beautiful in this mining community are the things that we could think of as things that are good and beautiful for us, and then we've got good and beauty within human relationships and how that functions. Okay, so the concept of beauty, the idea of beauty. So we've got beauty, we've got death, we've got regret. What was the first one we had? Relationships. Anything else? Yep.
Chrysanthemums.
Chrysanthemums.
They appear at, like throughout the whole thing in different circumstances. Like the old one was in his jacket, and the smell of dead, I think, at the end or something.
Yeah, and there's the little brown ones by the path of the soul. So yeah, we've also got chrysanthemums, and okay, how are chrysanthemums a theme? In one sense, they're symbolic. In one sense, they work as what we call a leitmotif. Do people know the term motif or leitmotif? Leitmotif. It's a particular image or pattern or recurrence of words that occurs several times within a text and often kind of nudges you to remember the coherence of the text or to see relationships across elements of the text that wouldn't otherwise perhaps have been apparent to you. So you can maybe look at the moments when chrysanthemums are mentioned, and you can trace, yes, they're there in page 1, they're there in page 3, they're there in page 10. What are the connections between these different uses of chrysanthemum? You may also be interested to know that at the end of the war, when the unknown soldier is buried in Westminster Abbey, there is a wreath of chrysanthemums placed on the unknown soldier's tomb. That's one of the first wreaths that's placed. So you've got this continual sense of chrysanthemums as in some ways having an association with death. Chrysanthemums as well nudges towards another element of beauty, an element of beauty we might think of in terms simply of the short story form, and whether or not this is an example, a particularly fine example or not, of how to write a short story, and what might be the kind of key components of a short story. And that brings us into all sorts of questions of form and style that would have been quite pressing. If you're a writer who's trying to make your living from your writing, you're going to want to make sure that your books are going to sell and that they're popular. And also, in Lawrence's case, you've got a very severe and very kind of practical message to give in your writing. So you're trying to construct stories that can actually say something about the society and life and experience of your time. So we've got to think about the genre of the short story and what Lawrence is doing within that genre, and how his construction of the short story can either be thought of as beautiful or moral or political or whatever. So there we are, they're the themes. So everybody knows what happens in the story. Yes? Anybody not know how it ends? Okay, how does it end? Somebody tell me, what happens at the end of the story? Yes?
She dies down the line from being smothered. Your husband.
That's at the end of the story?
Yes. Towards the end.
Okay, what happens at the very end of the story?
I don't remember.
Okay, so what we've got here is we can think of what's happened, and certainly the story is about a miner who, we're waiting for him to come home. Apparently could be down the pub. Turns out that he's not down the pub, he's been smothered in an accident down in the mines. He's brought home, and he's laid out in the parlour, and that's pretty much where the story ends. So the end of the story is with the wife, now widow, facing the fact of her husband's death. Okay, so what we've got there is interesting. There are elements of the plot that we can think of, yeah, well that's the story, but is that really the story? We've got things that happen at the surface and things that happen emotionally. And that's one of the ways we might want to think about how stories work, is what we have as the facts and what we have as the subtext. Okay, so certainly that's what happens at the end, is that she's written there, at last it was finished. An echo there in that final paragraph. We're all looking at the final paragraph, since you're all quickly, obviously checking what happens at the end of the book. At last it was finished. An echo there, Jesus on the cross, it is finished. Okay, a sense of a sacrifice that's made, a sense of something that's been achieved, a sense of the end of a process. At last it was finished. They covered him with a sheet and left him lying with his face bound. And she fastened the door of the little parlour, lest the children should see what was lying there. Then, with peace sunk heavy on her heart, she went about, making tidy the kitchen. She knew she submitted to life, which was her immediate master. But from death, her ultimate master, she winced with fear and shame. So that's kind of what happens at the end, is that we're within the psychology of this woman whose husband has just died. Okay, let's go through some of these slides now. So, Odour of Chrysanthemums, I thought you'd like some pictures of chrysanthemums. How do I move this on? Okay, so we talked about what the text is about. So we're on to the reverse of the slides that I've given to you. Sorry, we're still on the front page. This is slide 2 down here. So we're talking about what the text is about. And what this first slide does is really think about the reading process, what we do as literary critics, but also what we do basically as readers when we read text. So for a lot of you, this is going to be very familiar, and I'm just running through the process of reading a text. So, okay, I'm trying to make this do things that it doesn't want to do. So, we've talked a little bit about what kind of a text it is. We talked about it being a short story. We talked about, we could start to compare it to other short stories we know about death. We could start to compare it to other short stories from different periods, so it's certainly placed within a particular genre. Okay, if we start moving more deeply into the text, we could start looking at who is talking to whom within and around the text. And we can say, in what ways do you respond? So this is maybe where we are at the moment. We've started to talk a little bit about what happens in the text, so we could start talking about the relationships within the text, the relationship of the mother to the children, for instance, the relationship of the husband to the wife, the relationship of the mother-in-law to the son. Okay, so all those relationships and the way that they're structured within the text could be something, if you were writing about this text, you might say, okay, I want to compare how the mother-in-law talks to the son, and how the mother, the central figure of the narrative, talks to her own small son. Okay, is there a comparison to be made there? Is there something significant in the comparison? That's the sort of way you build up an account of relationships within the text. Then we've got this question of response, which is our responses to the text. And that's where I'm going to take another very quick pause, and I'd like you just to detail with your partner maybe two responses that you've had to the text. Initially that might be just simply whether you like it or not, whether it's boring or not, but I'd like actually to have a reason for that. If you like it, then tell me why you like it. If you have a more complex emotional or aesthetic response, then try to detail some area of that. So what kind of responses does this text generate? Responses do we have to this text? It's always important when we're thinking about the way we build an account or a critical reading of the text, and remember that our first exercise, our first assessment in this particular course will be in 3 or 4 weeks' time, when you'll be writing a critical reading or a critical account of one of the Prussian officer texts. It's always a good place to start is your feelings about the text or your response to it. So what responses do we have? Yep.
I like because of the style in which he writes descriptions. Like the description of the kitchen being really picturesque, the way he uses his onomatopoeias and alliterations.
Okay, so we've got several things there. We've got a question of style, and we can certainly analyse in more depth what are the characteristic features of this particular work of style. What's very interesting about the texts that are written at this time, as I said last week, is that this is a transitional period. This is when Lawrence is starting to take off as a writer, and he's somebody who's exploring different ways of writing and writing about different things. So we've got precisely that documentary aspect. He can describe the working class kitchen and the cottage and the area with an absolute precision, a documentary precision, a documentary realism, if you like. Interestingly, he's also starting to move away from that into what he was to become more famous for, in a sense, which was his writing of instinct, his writing of emotion, his writing of psychology. So we've got both of those things within this single text in the way that we've been reading. But yes, description's a key point, and style. So there's certainly things that one might react to. Some people love it, some people hate it, but it's being able to describe it and explain that reaction and explain how it works, which is part of your critical reaction to the text. Okay, somebody at the back, yeah? Yeah.
Got the weakness of the text, like all the way through, like the way he analyses it, like most of the new pieces, of course, very bleak and then it kind of leads up to obviously the ending when he dies. So you feel sorry for him, pity the character because of the bleak situation she finds herself in. Not only he dies, but
Okay, so yeah, I mean, it's a bleak text, it's a sad text, it's a text that in some sense is tragic. We may want to start using that particular term. Kind of part of the way it plays on our emotions is that it establishes a very moving and to some degree tragic scenario. This is a woman who has suffered and who will continue to suffer because of the conditions within which she's born, but also because of the choices that she has made. Okay, so there's a tragedy within the way that you take choices in life and things don't necessarily turn out as you wanted. Yeah?
I quite like the way the whole morbid, it's kind of impending as well. It's like
Excellent. Yeah, so we've got a whole further question of the short story and the way it constructs a sense of doom, a sense of kind of, what's the word, of fear, of anticipation, of foreboding. Yeah, so that's again part of the way that stylistically Lawrence manages to suggest that things are happening, and you know that something bad is going to happen. So again, part of your reaction is being bound up in the chronology of the story, if you like what's going to happen next, what is going to come, and then she goes out looking for her husband, which is kind of a real shame for her as it is, and she goes off and she has to talk to the neighbours and say, have you seen my husband? And she says, I'm not going to go to the pub to look for him, and then you just know that things aren't going to end well. So yeah, foreboding, the way in which the text is constructed. Yeah, there was somebody else up there.
Yeah, there's also
So an element of hope. Interesting. Yeah, if one were to go into biography and to relate this, say, to Sons and Lovers, in both of those texts you've got a sense of a father who is in some sense an oppressive figure, a dangerous figure, and a limiting figure. And so you've got a sense of, can we have release from this father? What's interesting about the version of Odour of Chrysanthemums that we have here is that at the end there's almost a hint of regret for the loss of the father as well. It's kind of at one and the same time we have a hope that we might move forward and a sense of a regret for missed opportunity. It's a very kind of ambivalent ending. It's interesting, but certainly, yeah, we've got a sense of potentially hope for these people. And there's somebody at the back, yeah? Did I see another hand? Okay, one more response. Sorry, Daniel.
I found it interesting when the text is full of relationships, and people are referred to often by their relationship to others rather than by their name. And yet, the ultimate realization that states is that there's a sort of solitary nature of people, the fact that her and her husband were actually very individual people who didn't really know each other at all. But I think it says the heat of life made them think they did know each other, and yet when death strips that away, it seems how separate they are from each other.
That's interesting, because it seems to me that you're absolutely right. If we look at the text, the way that people are introduced to us is very often in an almost impersonal way. We don't get their names first of all, we get the son, the wife, the tall woman. Names seem almost incidental to the story. Okay? And you're right again, that we're introduced in terms of people's relation to each other. So there is this paradox. The text pulls us both ways. At one end, we're thinking this is a text about how embedded we are in networks of relationship and networks of community. And you can imagine going through this text and pointing out those networks. It's where we started from. That's one of the great qualities of the text, is its demonstration of relationship. But at the same time, it's almost like at the other end of your experience is the sense of one's aloneness before death. Even in our most intimate moments, are we entirely separated out and singular and to some degree fearful? Or as she says at the end, before death, her ultimate master, she winced with fear and shame. And that seems to me that kind of goes beyond this notion of simply being alone, because to bring in fear and shame actually starts to bring us onto a moral terrain about what it is to be an individual faced with one's death or with death. The notion of shame is, why would she be ashamed before death? One could see why one might be frightened in front of death, but why would one be ashamed of death? That's something that one would want to consider as part of the moral structure of the text and the way that it treats being an individual. In terms of relationship as well, this is a text that also, I think, shows the way in which individuals are members of communities. That you've got the way in which the miner is a member of the mine community, and everybody knows each other's names and their relations in the pit. There's a very clear delineation of the mechanical functions or the professional functions of the mine manager and the butty, the man who leads the particular group that works together in the pit. Everybody has a role within that society, and even within the women there's a sense of knowing where everybody fits in. And this is maybe one of the last moments in the writing of realist fiction where the sense of what Raymond Williams has called a novel community exists, that you've got a novel that is able to represent the working of a community. People come round to the house, the train goes by, you know the driver of the train. So again, relationship is a really key way of thinking about the text, I think, and it ramifies into a number of different areas. And yes, do we respond to that in a sense of the loss of this kind of community relationship? Is it still like this in Eastwood? You walk down there, you know, we have our one Eastwood
It's
person.
not like if the bus went past, I'd know who the bus driver was. There's still families. It's not so much through the pits though now. It's transferred to like through the secondary school. So everyone knows each other. People have big families and like. It's not as much as it was before, like in olden days, kind of thing. But it's still like that. There's still families now that you say their name and you know that you don't make friends with them because they're odd or their kids get expelled from school. There's stuff like that goes on, definitely.
So they're not the people that you're friends with then?
No.
Okay, so I'm always interested in Lawrence because of his representation of community and because of the possibility of a narrative voice that can somehow seamlessly, you don't even really think about it, and then somebody says relationship and you think, what relationships are there in this text? And suddenly you see it's teeming with relationships. It's teeming with almost a geography of relationships. If you go to see people, and within that we've got this kind of documentary precision of the description of nature and description of places. But it's also, you have a network of connections with people. It's people who are totally connected up. And I think that's something always worth bearing in mind, how that's just part of the form of the text, these relations between people. Okay, I'll take one more sense of these responses to different elements of the text. Back to Eastwood.
I like that it's got this kind of like double layer through the whole short story. In that, like, there's one aspect of the text that looks at really human things, like going to the pub and she has a whinge about it, and the kids are having dinner and she has to put the kids to bed and that kind of thing. But then through Elizabeth, there's this like window into something deeper, like what we were talking about last week, that Lawrence started to touch on, this like other ego, this like subconscious thing. And I like that it sort of contrasts between the really normal and the really like community feel of life and everyday things, to then this sort of sense of like she feels ashamed of death or scared of it, and like really deep personal things that seem to.
But what's interesting as well is that I'm exactly with you on that. There's this tension between the level at which we kind of can tell about our experiences, like I went there, I did this, I saw X, Y, or Z, and then there's a level which is almost beneath consciousness. It's a level that's talking about something that Elizabeth perhaps, and we'll think about this in terms of what's called focalization in a moment, but would Elizabeth be able to articulate her feelings in this way? Would she recognise her feelings in this way? How do we write about feelings? Are feelings something that can be put into words? Is Lawrence's attempt to do this something that's successful? Is it something that's new? Because certainly this is a kind of different way. We're moving towards a different way of talking about the emotions and the unconscious. So that's another thing that certainly strikes me about the text. Okay, I'll take one more from that side since nobody's spoken up. Come on, you're keeping us waiting. The response said that we're back to the question from a couple of minutes ago. What would a response to some elements of the text? Okay.
Realisation about like the being of death and the helplessness of this man, he's died, and then like realising that that's human nature and everyone is moving towards that.
Ooh. So it's human nature. We'll come back to the notion of human nature, but certainly it comes to us all. And so you said we're moved by this sense of being implicated in the possibility of that. I mean, lecture halls, roofs falling in, it happens. One more from the far side. I mean, did anybody, what I'm hoping that somebody might feel would maybe the alienness of this experience, and the fact that this is in fact, yeah, I can see that death is something that comes to us all, that's kind of human, but that this kind of story is something that's really now, it's put in a little historical, almost a period box now, that to some degree it's alien to our experience. Did anybody feel alienated or unsympathetic to the story? You are permitted to feel alienated and unsympathetic. Okay. Clearly not. Oh yes?
I think it sounds like a simple story to it because it's such a familiar concept.
Okay, so it's very familiarity kind of prevents it from being alien. Okay. Right. What have we got next on our list? We've talked about then who's talking to whom and in what ways we respond and things like that. we're starting to talk now, when we're thinking about death, when we're thinking about community, about a version or vision of experience. Okay, and then we're thinking, yeah, are we happy about this? Do we share this kind of structure of values? Do we share the structure of feeling? Do we see a particular political case being made here? I'm interested in that as a question that I can give you just 2 quick minutes on. Can you see that there's a particular political vision in this text? Would you imagine looking at this that there was a particular political point being made? A couple of minutes.